A while back, I made a video about luck in board games. And in that video, I touched on Quacks of Quedlinburg. Now, I was playing with the new version, with the recreated art, which, to put it bluntly, is quite divisive. The old art had character, it was funky, grimy, and really sold the messiness of being a back alley potion maker. While this new art was critiqued as sanitized and generic, a fusion of claymation and corporate Memphis, like a Grubhub commercial blended with a cereal box. So originally this was going to be an entire 6-hour-long podcast about Quacks and its art debacle, but the deeper I dug, the more I kept circling one question. How is art important in board games? And truthfully, it's very, very easy for me to just take the easy question. Is art important? And then purple prose and wax poetically about the immense value of art and expression and visual creativity in games. I could just cash in my good boy internet points for some slaps on the back and call it a day. But that doesn't answer anything. The trickier question isn't if art is important, but how it's important. So today, let's move past the easy question and really dig into the function of art. How does art shape our experience, guide our decisions, bend us to its will, and create the magic circle we play in? So, where do we start? Let's start with an experiment. Let's take the art away. I grabbed my copy of Skull, a game that usually drips with gorgeous art, and I abstracted it to its fundamental essence. I swapped out every tile for sticky notes. Just sticky notes. 5 little squares, 3 scribbled lines, and that was enough for each player to play. What's neat is when you peel away the art, the core of the game remains unharmed. The bluffing is just as tense, the decisions feel just as meaningful. All the feelings and the weight survive. The magic circle stays completely intact. How? Let's break down what's actually happening in Skull. Each player has a single skull tile and 3 flower tiles, plus a reversible mat that tracks their score. While the art itself is beautiful, there isn't that much of it, which is why it's a perfect candidate for this experiment. But what is the art actually doing? To answer this, we need to borrow some ideas from the wonderful world of semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols. In essence, every sign has 2 parts, the signifier, which is the image or the word, and the signified, which is the concept it represents. In Skull, the drawing of a skull is the signifier, while the signified concept is a negative outcome in this challenge. Now, I want to avoid a subtle confusion. A skull isn't a random symbol that just looks cool. We all know it's an established cultural symbol for danger that has been linked for generations and generations. And the game leans on that linkage for good reason. But, and this is a key insight, for the game's mechanics, that link is 100% arbitrary. The rules only need a danger symbol and a safe symbol. The skull's meaning in the game is purely defined by the rulebook. It would be equally playable if we call the game Flower, and arbitrarily decide that the flower tile is the negative outcome, and the skulls are actually the safe ones. The gameplay would be fundamentally unaffected. This means the specific artwork is detachable from its function. Because its meaning is learned within the game, you could replace the skull and the flower with an X and an O, a red dot and a green dot, and the machinery of the game wouldn't change one bit. The player mat is even a clearer example. It's just a way to show a 0 or a 1. That's why my sticky note version with only 3 scribbles, the gameplay, the ludic function of the artwork, is easily satisfied. So would I still call this game, this heavily rethemed game into sticky note abstraction, Skull? Or is it something else? Is it the same as retheming another game? Is it like the Quacks debacle? Or how about a chess set with SpongeBob pieces? I think for all intents and purposes, my sticky note version is still Skull. The mechanical heartbeat of the game is so perfectly preserved, it's hard to call it anything else. It survived this abstraction because its art functions as a symbolic layer on top of the mechanics, not a core part of those gameplay mechanics. But what happens if we try this experiment with a different style of game? So let's explore this from the other direction. What happens if we try the same experiment on a game like Dixit? Could we de-artify it? I actually don't think I could. I think it's so impossible that it's actually paradoxical. This is because Dixit sits at the opposite end of the semiotic spectrum from Skull. If Skull's art is symbolic and its meaning is arbitrary, Dixit's art is intentionally iconic and polysemic. Iconic in that the images resemble actual things, and polysemic basically meaning that each image is designed to have multiple potential meanings. The game's entire mechanic is an engine that runs on this engineered ambiguity. The rules require you to navigate the polysemy of the cards, to find a clue that connects to one of the image's meanings, but not so obviously that it becomes univocal, or only having one singular meaning. This is why, even if I replace the cards with random, badly drawn squiggles, meant to be entirely gibberish, the game itself would still be functional. But the nature of that functionality is completely different from our stripped-down version of Skull. Imagine with me, in Dixit, the storyteller said, "When you forget to turn off the stove when you leave on vacation." You would look at your hand of squiggles and find the one that feels most like frantic, anxious energy. It's all related to our tendency to create connections with the arbitrary. If you stare at anything long enough, feelings will well up inside of you from some sort of primal instinct to sort and categorize. We are pattern-seeking monsters. We can't help but create meaning from nothing. It's kind of like how Quirk drew Dignity back in 1996. The shape itself was to mock Quirk within the show. But on a meta level, when I see the shape today, almost 30 years later, I still think of Dignity. I literally can't help it. I associate Dignity with this shape. It's arbitrary and it's sickening, but the association is burned into my brain since I was a child. Another infamous example is the Loss webcomic. People associate this pattern of sticks with this comic that has been seared into their minds. A completely arbitrary shape will be able to hold meaning and has capacity for interpretation. In the same way, I find the challenge of de-artifying Dixit to be impossible. Even my worst scribbles would become art the moment the game forces interpretation, right? No matter what you put on these papers, the game's rules turn it into a form of art, and the game still works. It would still functionally play. So while de-artifying Dixit is mechanically impossible, the soul of the game is still tied to that quality of art, right? A game of Dixit with my chicken scratches would work on a foundational level, but it would be an impoverished experience compared to the whimsical journey the real cards provide. A couple of scribbles would feel hollow and soulless relative to Dixit's actual art. So you can't remove the art like in Skull, because Dixit itself is an engine that creates it. You can only replace it with worse art, I think. Anyways, back on topic. Skull's art is primarily a signifier of binary game states, while Dixit's art is a mechanism of gameplay itself. Simply put, you can change the art in Skull while retaining the quality of the game, but Dixit will have its gameplay fundamentally altered. So yeah, there's definitely a distinction in how art's purpose and function is between these two games. With Dixit, no matter whatever you put on these cards, the game's rules turn it into art by forcing interpretation. And that's the paradox of trying to de-artify it. It would be a very different experience from the beautiful game we know. But then the question is, how much of this elusive soul, the game's essence, the vibe, is lost? Okay, so we've established two extremes of a spectrum. On one side, we have Skull, where the art is purely a signifier of the game's state. On the other side, we have Dixit, where the art is the fuel for the game's mechanical engine. In the Dixit experiment, the game was still functional when we removed the art due to the nature of the game itself. But I would argue, and possibly not convince anyone, that this version of Dixit made the experience impoverished. Something essential was missing. That hard-to-define quality, the thing that exists in the space between the rules and the pictures, is what I'm going to call the game's soul. What do I mean by soul? It's an obviously hard thing to define, and it defies a concrete definition no matter what you could possibly muster. It's a fluid and slippery quality that is actually, I think, often circularly defined. But it's something I think that can be felt. To me, it's the emotional resonance that emerges when mechanics, narrative, and art align. It's the feeling of cohesiveness between what your eyes see and what your brain starts to believe. Now look, you might call this immaterial, poorly defined essence of a game whatever you want. You can call it the vibe, the mingling, the game's funk. It doesn't really matter what it's called, but I think it's a source of tension in many, many games. This conflict of a game's soul is where most games exist along the spectrum. Not at these extremes like with Skull and Dixit, but in this murky middle ground. And this middle ground is home to a classic debate in game design, often framed as the tension between ludology and narratology. Put simply, is a game about its mechanics, the ludic, or is it about the story it tells, the narrative? For most games, the answer is both, and the art is the bridge between the two. It's what connects the abstract machinery of the rules to a world we can imagine ourselves in. I think a really solid example of how soul can manifest itself differently can be found in the game Twilight Imperium 4 versus Ark's The Blighted Reach. Both games are massive, lengthy excursions for galactic dominance. The theme itself is extremely similar, and if someone told you you want to join a 12-hour game with dice chucking, politics, personal objectives, and a ton of unique alien abilities, you really wouldn't be able to tell which game you're about to play. And yet the soul of these games is decidedly different. Ark's has this overlay of goofiness. The art style celebrates a certain levity, an acknowledgement of how messy things are about to get. And the soul of this game relishes in the sense of playfulness. It's funny in a sense, both in gameplay and in art style. On the other hand, Twilight Imperium takes itself immensely seriously. Sure, there are hilarious moments, but these mostly come from the player interactions and the absurdity of situations, not so much within the game itself. It has a veneer of this is a serious game for serious gamers, which all brings a hefty gravitas because of how the artwork conveys scale and importance to every planet and faction, and especially with every decision. Now, if you could imagine with me for a moment, if Arcs or Twilight Imperium were somehow able to trade artwork completely, I think there would be similar backlash from the fans of both games to the same vein of what happened to Quacks. It forms a misalignment of the narrative flavor of the game and the art style itself. It's a rejection of the soul. Okay, let's talk about Scythe. Scythe is arguably one of the prettiest board games out there, but from a purely ludic perspective, its gameplay, it's a fairly deterministic engine of resource conversion and area control. Its mechanics, its cold machinery, could be represented on a spreadsheet without any gameplay loss. The encounters could be printed out pieces of paper, and the mechs could be small little cubes. The game would be functionally identical, just like in my sticky note skull example. But would anyone want to play that version? Of course not. The game's success is inseparable from its narrative layer, provided by that evocative, melancholy art. These visuals create a powerful sense of place and overlays a mood that elevates the experience from math into a story. But the Scythe onion has another layer, the persistent itch of the soul being pulled in different directions, what the smart people amongst us call ludonarrative dissonance, wherein there's a perceived conflict between the game's narrative and the ludology, the gameplay. Just look at it. The box art and the tower and mech miniatures and the leaders all scream epic war game. From a superficial glance, The art and Scythe's narrative promises conflict. But for the most part, the gameplay is a quiet, head-to-the-ground efficiency puzzle about resource conversion. Combat is rare, and it really acts more like a detriment to further expansion. A player can easily win without ever really fighting anyone. And for many, this is classic dissonance. The story and imagery promises a war game, but the mechanics reward keeping to oneself and optimizing. But I think that's a misreading. Scythe is much more a Cold War game, a game about using the little you have to build up into something more. And when you see it that way, the game becomes a fantastic example in ludo-narrative consonance, or harmony. The giant mechs are just another resource and tool for efficiency, rather than for combat. Or perhaps even a form of detriment to aggression, much like mutually assured destruction in real life. It replicates the feeling of a real arms race through engine building and efficiency puzzles. But of course, you could also just argue that calling it a Cold War simulator is a valid interpretation, but it's also a retroactive justification created by the community to resolve that original dissonance that the game itself creates. Essentially, this harmonious reading is, well, it's a cope, a well-argued and intellectually satisfying cope, but a cope nonetheless. For some players, Scythe will always feel dissonant. Why do the mechs look like they're ready for war when fighting barely matters? For others, the Cold War reading clicks perfectly. The same game, the same mechanics, the same art, but radically different interpretations. This whole debate demonstrates another real function of art in a game like Scythe. It's an interpretive lens. The mechanics simply say collect resources efficiently, but the art is what creates that debate. Seen through a wargame lens, and the art and the mechanics feel dissonant, but seen through a Cold War efficiency lens, they click into perfect harmony. In essence, the art actively shapes our understanding of the mechanics and how we internally feel about the game. It creates an element of the soul. So when that lens shifts or is deliberately changed, like it was with Quacks, the entire soul of the game shifts with it. And finally, that brings us directly back to Quacks. I think we can finally answer the Quacks of Quedlinburg dilemma. The mechanics, the ludic core, didn't change with the new art. What changed was the soul that linked the gameplay and the narrative. The original's grimy art sold the theme of being a back alley charlatan. The new art sells the fantasy of a friendlier, sterile market of the modern corporate world. One isn't functionally better, but they offer two completely different invitations into the game's world. It's like the soul was switched. And I think we have one final piece of the puzzle to talk about. It's all about paratext. Paratext is everything around the game that frames your experience before you even punch out the tokens. The box art, the font, the title itself. It's like a promise the game makes to you on the shelf. The original Quacks of Quedlinburg felt like it belonged on a gamer's shelf. It had the design of so many Euro games that permeated the mid-2010s. Even the name, Quacks of Quedlinburg, follows a traditional board game naming convention, like Lords of Waterdeep, Champions of Midgard, and of course, Settlers of Catan. It's even mocked in pop culture, like the Cones of Dunshire from Parks and Rec. There's a subtle but powerful paratext created just from the statement X of Y. The title alone signals that this is a game for people who already play games. In the same way, simplifying the name of the game is a paratextual way to lower the perceived entry point for consumers. There's nothing inherently wrong with this name change, but it is an indicator to consumers of all types. Just like what happened to Catan, it's happening to Quacks. There's a conscious appeal to simplicity and approachability. So, how is art important in board games? I think its role is not one single thing. Instead, it's more of a spectrum of function. For a game like Skull, the artwork is primarily a way to communicate mechanics. It's a fragile skin that can be peeled away and is ultimately just arbitrarily created and defined. For a game like Dixit, the art is the ludic function, and it's the structure in which the gameplay is built upon. But for most games, art is the invitation to the soul of the game. It's a transformative element from cold mechanics into narrative, and a bridge into inhabiting a mindset or experience. It's the perceived feelings that one will begin to associate with the game. In Quacks, that soul shifted. The function of art in this case was one of invitation. It was the feelings that the game elicited and the perception that was placed on individual players. It changed from a game that felt a little weird, with a language and art style that spoke to people who are more familiar and serious about games, to a game that was more palatable and marketable to a general mass. The reality is the Quacks controversy was never about objective gameplay quality, because both versions are well-crafted, fun, easy to jump into games. It was about the feelings around the invitation into the experience. The original's grimy, quirky art invites you to be a back alley potion maker, while the new art felt more like an invitation to a mobile game. The backlash was a critique to the fantasy on offer, and the roles players wanted to fill. The old Quacks said, "This is a Euro game, a game for the hobbyist's shelf," while the new Quacks says, "This is a family game, you can buy me at Target next to Monopoly." And look, at a personal level, I actually really like the new artwork. I think the goofy, funny gameplay really matches the friendly aesthetic and is a better representation of what people will actually experience. It's the version I have on my Calyx, and it's really easy to pick out for people to play. Truthfully, Quacks, it's a good game. It works perfectly as an enjoyable experience for a wide range of people. So I don't really see the new artwork as a misalignment with its gameplay. Instead, it's a deliberate attempt to broaden its paratext to an audience that's likely to appreciate it. The new visuals say family fun time more than they say heavy thinking Euro game. I think that's a much fairer and more accurate way to present what the game actually is. And look, there's a sense of ludo-narrative consonance that exists in both versions of Quacks. But I do think there's an element of consumer expectation consonance that is better paired with the new art. It's a form of setting the right expectation for people who are completely oblivious to the wide range of board games that exist. But what are the real, tangible results? Schmidt Spiele can now sell Quacks at Walmart. It turns out the real quackery wasn't in the potions being brewed, but it was in transforming a niche product into mass market gold. And you know what? If you run a business and have an entry-level board game, you really want it to be next to Monopoly and Walmart, because those mass market games are where the majority of the money is. The hobbyist market we love is just a smaller fraction of the pie. The change in art is a paratextual invitation to this broader audience and creates a new soul that is more in line with what people who just want to play a family game expect. And it's not a wrong approach either. Like I mentioned, I think Quacks is a good entry-level game. So for them to actively target the mass market, it makes complete sense. This Quacks debacle is a story about soul. It's a soul that's changed because it was an attempt to reframe who the game is for. That's why hobby gamers felt like something was stolen and replaced with something lesser. The invitation wasn't specifically for us anymore. It was rewritten into a more playful, less serious kind of gamer. Through that soul swap, Quacks faced rejection by those who felt it was originally for, but now it's no longer for them alone. And look, if you love or hate this new art direction, that's totally fine either way. It's not the end of life itself. It's just a case study on why you might feel a certain way about the soul of a game and how you react to a shift. It's just a fascinating dive into your own psyche. And there we go. This wasn't a 6-hour podcast like I planned, but that's all I can think of for right now. I hope you enjoyed my musings, and as always, thanks for watching. And bye.